to some Dhamma talk or reflections. But whatever we are doing, we can be mindful of what we are doing. Sometimes when we have a bell, to invite the bell at the beginning of meditation, or we invite the sound of the bell when we end a formal sitting meditation, this can lead us to the idea that meditation starts or ends. And in a way that is helpful to dedicate specific time for formal practice, but it is also maybe very dangerous in terms of when we have the idea meditation is only in a specific way. It starts with a bell when we sit quietly, it ends with a bell. That's fatal to the continuity of practice in a way. When you look at your life as a follower of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, how can we actually in our daily life bring more Dhamma into our daily life? Bring more wakefulness, this quality of mindfulness. In the busyness of our life, yesterday afternoon, I was taken to this beautiful park. And of course, part of that experience is traffic in Bengaluru. And I've been in other towns now the last few weeks. That takes a lot of patience, being stuck in the traffic. What a privilege to sit in an air-conditioned car, not to be on a motorcycle, two-wheeler or auto rickshaw, to be a bit protected from the fumes. But how can we bring to this experience a quality of mindfulness, a quality maybe of training the mind? The Buddha recommended to sit in nature or to live close to nature. Sometimes we might have an opportunity to do that, but when we are in the town, does it mean we cannot practice, or we can only practice when we go to a quiet place, maybe to a beautiful place like Mahabodhi Society, with a beautiful Bodhi tree, meditation hall, nice teachers, Sangha, friends may be present. Yes, it is helpful, but really on a daily basis, how can we bring Buddha, Dharma, Sangha closer to our heart, closer into our lives? One friend in Austria was telling this story that many of us maybe look at our lives and we ask, how can we bring Dhamma more into our lives? Maybe a good question, but it sounds a bit like first comes our life, our, habits, what we do, and then we look, where is some space for Dhamma there? Maybe we should first put Dhamma and then see, how we can bring our life to Dhamma. Do you see the difference in approach? First our life and where's Dhamma? Or do we put Dhamma first and then whatever we do in our life, is that or can we make that Dhamma? Sometimes I must admit, I observe I have some lofty ideas what Dhamma practice is or meditation. Even so, I practice a few years or try to practice. The mind is powerful with its habits, of course, as we know. When I'm not such a skilled meditator in terms of, having easy access to deep samadhi, to deep concentration, or jhanic states, absorptions, that the mind can really, in an easy way, experience piti, rapture, this kind of joy, and sukha, happiness. Does it mean I failed, to practice meditation or Dhamma? Or can I just be with what the mind is experiencing with each moment, one moment at a time? Right now, when we are aware of how we sit, on the cushion, on the mat, on the chair, simply as I'm sitting on a chair, I'm aware how the buttocks touches the chair, the cushion on the chair, how the feet touch the floor, how the hand touch each other. And this is centering. This knowing is a kind of knowing. Nothing big, nothing special, but very doable in this moment. It allows the mind to become peaceful to a certain extent. When we really simply come to this present moment experience, knowing what is happening. That's a quality, the Buddha means the one who knows. And we can only access this, of course, in this moment. Visiting India for me is, of course, a very special experience in terms of privilege, visiting the holy places where Lord Buddha was born, visiting the place where he left the palace, apparently, where he gained awakening, in Buddhaya, having even the privilege teaching retreat there to young monastics. Visiting Sarnath, the place where he first taught the 5 ascetics, where he, set in motion the wheel of Dhamma. And then also visiting some other places which had significance for his life, but also Vishinara, where he passed away. Special places which can be also interesting in terms of very noisy. There come these pilgrimage groups from different countries, sometimes led by a monk with a speaker, and then, it's sometimes very noisy, sometimes very busy. The different Buddhist cultures, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. And then occasionally we have silence. Connecting maybe in a way with the Buddha which allows the Buddha with, maybe or after, reciting inspiring verses, teachings of the Dhamma. As the Buddha was pointing out, the one who sees the Dhamma sees me, or the one experiences Dhamma experiences the Buddha. This is how the Buddha becomes alive. An image of the Buddha didn't exist, of course, during the time of the Buddha. He was encouraging to worship like the Bodhi tree, rather than an image of him. But it can be a powerful reminder, reminding us of this capacity to know. In my experience, we often limit ourselves in our understanding of Dhamma and meditation, what it really means to practice the Dhamma. As I said earlier, I often observe I have some quite lofty ideas. When the mind sometimes, experiences greed, or sometimes many times experiences greed, some desire, some strong wishes, sometimes some obsession even with certain things, or some aversion, some resistance, some negativity, stress. Other times we simply don't know. There might be doubts, uncertainty, difficult periods in our lives. There's this one famous discourse where, I forgot, was it a naked ascetic was asking the Buddha, how can it be understood that the Dhamma is apparent here and now? And the Buddha was teaching something like, when you know there is greed, that is how the Dhamma is experienced here and now. When you know there is hate, when you know there is delusion, and when you know the mind is free from greed, when you know the mind is free from hate, when you know the mind is free from delusion or not knowing. I often have the idea, Dhamma means practice freedom from greed, hate, and delusion. But the nature of the unawakened mind is to have these 6 roots: greed, hate, delusion, and non-greed, non-hate, non-delusion. So don't be frustrated or impatient when these kilesas, these defilements, have such a power. When we know greed as greed, hate as hate, aversion as aversion, not knowing as not knowing, that is a kind of knowing. When the Buddha was tempted by Mara, the tempter, it was never, that the Buddha wanted to kill Mara, but this famous statement, Mara, I know you. So how can we this apply, when there's greed, hate, delusion, to know it? Ideally, the Buddha often pointed out to make an effort to understand the causes and conditions why unwholesome states arise and pass away, and why wholesome states arise and pass away. Of course, we can try as much as we can to understand this, but to be honest, often I don't understand why certain mind states or conditions arise or not. According to the law of karma, action and the results of actions, karma and vipaka, only a fully awakened Buddha knows all the details of how this really works. To a certain extent we can understand, but only to a certain extent. So again, for me, this is an invitation not to get frustrated when I don't understand why certain things arise or not, or why does it take so long from my ego perspective, this belief of a self, to purify the mind. Why is life not more simple, less complicated, less stressful? Then there's this famous saying, we are in the Kali Yuga age, this dark age, and it goes down. Yes, when we look at certain things in the world, pollution, climate change, overpopulation, in certain areas of life, clear, maybe less morality. But there's also other tendencies, other things to look at in this life, where more people take care of themselves, try to care for others, try to look, what do we do to this planet? How can we live in ways that is more kind, more compassionate, more joyful, and, facilitates more equanimity, these 4 divine abides, so you can say, the Brahma Viharas, these powerful emotions, qualities of the heart. Where to find a balance between withdrawing ourselves from the world. I mean, even as monastics, like you have wonderful training opportunities here in places like Mahabodhi Society for the young monastics, or the laity when you come here to listen to the Dhamma. But Bhante Buddha, who founded this place, is such an inspiring teacher and model. And, his followers, and is it 21 branches now? I heard. This is an inspiring development over the last less than 80 years. Less than 70 years even, So when we focus on what's happening in the world, on what is wholesome, that nourishes us and can inspire us to cultivate the wholesome ourselves and to share it. When the Buddha talks about the practice of sila, morality, it's not just that he encourages us to keep the 5 silas or 8 silas, whatever we choose, but also encouraging others. Sometimes I tell this story when I was living as a layperson in Thailand, in the monasteries, helping the monks. I was living in a small monastery where occasionally meditation retreat happened, but normally it was very quiet. There was a German monk living. And on every full moon day, new moon day, in between moon days, some lay people came, mainly women, to offer food to the monks, and they took the 5 precepts. So the monks recite, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa 3 times. They repeat. And then they recite as we have done earlier. Anatipata veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami. And the lay people repeat Panatipata. So this one woman, while she was reciting, I undertake the precept to refrain from killing living beings, a mosquito had a not so pleasant experience. His or her life was ended. So obviously, the outer actions were not corresponding with outer actions in terms of what we did were not corresponding with our mind, So I can recite, I undertake the training to refrain from killing, and while I do this, I kill intentionally. Or was it total lack of mindfulness? So sometimes we might smile at such an incident, but we can look at our own lives sometimes, how we do like that. The intention is one thing, but what we do is easily another one. This is this incredible quality of the Buddha, which they say from the moment of his awakening, the 35 years on the full moon day of Vesak, of May, until the moment he entered Parinibbana, 45 years later, his thinking, his speaking, and his acting was in total harmony. There were no discrepancies. This is quite unbelievable, when I look at my own mind sometimes, what I think, what I speak, what I act is enough times in my judgment about myself, too many times, not in harmony. So again, we need to cultivate patience, kindness, and knowing, when greed, hate, and delusion have its power over us, over our lives. To know, ideally to come back to wholesome states of mind. As we know, in one mind moment, there can be only wholesome or unwholesome. The moment you are mindful, even of an unwholesome mind state, that mindfulness in itself is something wholesome, something to cultivate. Then you are not completely under the grip of the greed, hate, or delusion. When you know there's maybe a space, a little gap of possibility, maybe letting go. But sometimes this letting go seems to be, we need to know it first. And this need to know, in a way, is not this immediate resistance I want to get rid of, because that often gives unwholesome mind states and emotions more power, the more resistance there is. I want to get rid of. Do you know that kind of inner mental reaction? There is the I, there is the wanting, and rid of in terms of, if we are not careful, kind of negative attitude. Yes, ultimately that's our goal. But the more we fight something, we might strengthen this illusion of self, of me. I am somebody, I own a certain experience. Then this wanting, is, according to the Buddha, tanha. One of the desires he was describing was this vibhava tanha, this desire not wanting to exist. And when we look at our mental states, sometimes or many times or enough times, we don't want to exist in a certain way, when we are impatient, when we are full of judgments, when we have aversion, when we are sick. So many experiences we don't want to experience. So when this desire not wanting to be in that way is very strong, that's a kind of vibhava tanha, a cause of dukkha. When we know an unpleasant experience and we have a lot of aversion, resistance to it, the dukkha increases. One of my teachers, an American monk, Yogavacha Rahula, once shared a formula, similar like Einstein shared this formula, E equals mc square, a formula like dukkha on one side of the equation. Dukkha I prefer not to translate as suffering, because that often limits our understanding, but I understand dukkha more as an experience of something which is not ultimately 100% satisfying and lasting. That's quite a lot of things, right? Actually, it's everything except one thing, according to the Buddha. So dukkha on one side of the equation, and on the other side of the equation, pain as an umbrella term for something unpleasant, challenging, multiplied by resistance. So the point is, the more resistance there will be, the stronger the dukkha is. If you take an example like I will suffer, yes, sometimes, yes, from knee pain. That's why I sit on a chair. That's why I have difficulties walking, because of arthritis. So if there is, let's say, the factor of the pain 10, and I have really strong resistance to that pain, also 10, according to this formula, pain 10 multiplied by resistance 10, I have 100 factor of dukkha. So what happens if the resistance is less? The acceptance is bigger, the kindness is bigger to be with that pain. According to this equation, dukkha would be less. Can you see that in your own experience? When you experience something unpleasant, challenging, when there is less resistance, there is less dukkha. There's less mental stress. So what is if there's no resistance? According to this formula, there's a no dukkha, right? But there's still pain, maybe. Is that the answer? So the end of suffering, according to this formula, is not the end of something unpleasant. It's our mental reaction, our mental response, our mental being with experience. The Buddha, according to the suttas, experienced sickness, back pain, but he wasn't suffering from it. He experienced old age. I don't know. When one says, does he experience being with the unpleasant? The suttas describe situations where the Buddha, in one occasion, went to the forest for 3 months because he was, this is my interpretation maybe, but he seemed to look for some solitude and quiet because many of the young monks were so noisy that he needed some rest from that. And he met this, big elephant bull who also went to the forest alone for 3 months or so to be away from the herd of young elephant cows and, group of young elephants. To me, this makes the Buddha very human. That he was still very, of course, experiencing natural tendencies, but he was quite free. In the Buddhist tradition, as you know, or hopefully know, it was not just when you look at the suttas or the Vinaya teachings that the wonderful stories were transmitted, but also the humanness. How monks and nuns behaved in the Buddha's time. Devadatta tried to kill him, others tried to harm the Buddha. All that is part of his life. Where there is great light, darkness wants to come in, of course. So maybe we can, apply this to a certain extent to our own life, to our own challenges of life, and see the possibility the moment we stop, the moment we pause, we can be mindful. We can listen. I want to end my little Dhamma talk